She was 21 years old the summer she stood alone on a dust-choked platform with nothing to her name but a small cloth purse, and the man who had put her there was her own uncle, Garrison Teal, who told the whole town of Millbrook Crossing that a niece without a husband or a trade was a debt he could no longer afford to carry. She had $6.40, every bit of it earned scrubbing floors and keeping accounts for the mercantile, and with 6 of those dollars she bought the town's abandoned grain elevator, standing empty and condemned at the edge of the rail spur, sold to her by a county assessor glad to finally strike it from his books. It was, by any sober measure, a foolish, desperate purchase, a hollow tower of warped timber that couldn't feed her, couldn't shelter her from a hard winter, and hadn't held a bushel of wheat in 6 long years. But buried beneath its loading platform, sealed away where no assessor or auctioneer had ever thought to dig, lay a truth about her own family that had been kept from her, and from an entire farming community, for nearly 2 decades, a truth that would restore to both of them what had quietly been stolen. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Alara Voss. If you've ever been told your family's story was smaller, plainer, or less worthy than it truly was, we think you'll find something of yourself in Alara before this story is through. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if these stories mean something to you, follow or subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. Alara Voss was born in the spring of 1877 in Millbrook Crossing, a farming settlement built along a slow bend of the Cottonwood River in central Kansas, where the land rolled gold with wheat every August, and the whole rhythm of the town's life turned, season after season, around the harvest and the grain elevator that stood at its center like a church steeple made of timber and tin. Her father, Henrik Voss, had been one of the 6 founding farmers of the Millbrook Grain Cooperative, a modest but fiercely proud arrangement the settlers had built together in the town's earliest years so that no single buyer, no distant railroad agent or grain speculator from Topeka could ever again dictate to them what their harvest was worth. Henrik was a broad, quiet, deliberate man, slow to anger and slower still to boast, and he taught Alara, almost before she could reach the top of a grain barrel, the 2 things he believed mattered most in a life spent close to the land: that the soil rewarded patience more reliably than it rewarded cleverness, and that a cooperative, a true cooperative, was only as strong as the honesty of the men who kept its books. He was, by trade and temperament, the cooperative's bookkeeper as much as its farmer, the man the other 5 founding families trusted to tally every wagon of wheat that crossed the elevator's scale and to divide the season's proceeds fairly among them, and he carried that trust the way some men carry a family name, as something to be protected even at cost to himself. Alara's mother, Margaret, had come from a family of millers back east, and brought with her a keen, practical mind for figures that she passed to her daughter early, teaching her to read a scale and balance a column before she'd finished learning her letters properly, so that by the age of 10 Alara could sit beside her father in the elevator's small office, checking his sums against her own on a slate, delighting him with how rarely she found an error, and more than once catching one he'd genuinely made. It was in that small office, dust motes turning gold in the slanted light through the loading platform's high window, that Alara absorbed the deepest lesson of her childhood, one she would not fully understand the weight of for another decade, that her father sometimes worked late into the evening on ledgers he did not show even to her. Quiet and careful in a way that felt less like ordinary bookkeeping and more like a man guarding something. The cooperative's fortunes, modest but steady through Alara's early childhood, began to shift when she was 9, with the arrival in Millbrook Crossing of a grain buyer and land agent named Silas Pruitt, a smooth, ambitious man representing a consolidated milling concern out of Kansas City that wanted, more than anything, to buy up the small independent elevators scattered across the county and fold their farmers into contracts that guaranteed the milling concern's profits far more reliably than they guaranteed the farmers. Henrik Voss, alone among the cooperative's founders, argued hard against selling any part of their independence to Pruitt's company, and for a time his stubbornness carried the day, the other 5 families trusting the man who'd kept their books honestly for a decade over a stranger with a persuasive tongue and a fine suit. But the drought years of the middle 1880s were hard on Millbrook Crossing, as they were hard on the whole of the plains, and by the time Alara was 10, 2 of the cooperative's founding families, desperate for cash to see them through a second poor harvest, had quietly sold their shares in the elevator to Silas Pruitt's company, giving him, for the first time, a genuine foothold inside the very cooperative Henrik had helped build to keep men like him out. It was in the 2 years that followed, years Alara would only piece together fully as an adult, that her father discovered something in the elevator's own accounts that troubled him gravely. That grain being weighed and recorded under the cooperative's books at one figure was being sold onward, through Pruitt's growing influence over the buying contracts, at a considerably higher figure. The difference quietly pocketed, rather than divided among the farmers whose wheat it actually was. Henrik, characteristically, said little to anyone outside his own household about what he'd found, choosing instead to build his case carefully, the way he built everything, recording dates and weights and discrepancies in a private ledger of his own rather than the cooperative's official books, intending, Alara would later understand, to bring proof rather than accusation before the remaining founding families once he had gathered enough of it to be believed. He did not live to finish gathering it. In the winter of 1889, when Alara was 12, Henrik Voss died of a fever that swept through Millbrook Crossing that season, taking 11 souls with it before the cold broke. And with him died, so far as anyone in the town ever knew, whatever proof he had been quietly assembling against Silas Pruitt. Alara's mother, Margaret, struggled on alone for 3 more years, keeping their small farmhouse and taking in weaving work to make ends meet. But the fever that had taken Henrik left her own health permanently weakened, and when she died in turn in the spring of Alara's 15th year, Alara was left with no immediate family at all beyond her father's younger brother, Garrison Teal, properly her step-uncle, married to Henrik's late sister. Though the town had always simply called him Uncle for ease, a hog trader of modest means and considerably less patience than her father had possessed, Garrison took Alara in, not from any particular affection but from a sense of obligation he made sure she understood came at a cost, and for 6 years she earned her keep in his household through relentless, unacknowledged labor, cooking and cleaning, and increasingly as she grew older, keeping his own trading accounts, a skill she'd inherited from both parents, and that Garrison exploited without ever once thanking her for it. By the time Alara was 21, Silas Pruitt's milling concern had, through slow, patient acquisition over more than a decade, come to own a controlling interest in nearly every grain operation in the county, including, at last, full ownership of what had once been the Millbrook Cooperative's elevator itself, which Pruitt's company had shuttered and condemned 6 years before Alara's 21st birthday, choosing to route the county's grain instead through a newer, larger facility built closer to the rail junction, and leaving the old elevator to stand empty and forgotten at the edge of town, its scale rusted, its loading platform sagging, a monument to an independence the farmers of Millbrook Crossing had lost so gradually that most of them could no longer say exactly when it had slipped away. It was that same spring that Garrison Teal, his own trading business finally failing under debts he'd let grow too long, told Alara plainly that he could no longer afford to keep a niece who brought him no dowry prospects and no husband on the horizon, and put her out with barely a week's notice, giving her, as the whole of what he considered her due after 6 years of unpaid labor. $6.40 in coin, which was, he told her without any apparent shame, more than fair. Alara might, in the weeks that followed, have taken a room at the boarding house until her small hoard ran out and then hired herself into service in some wealthier household in the county, and this was, in truth, exactly what most of Millbrook Crossing assumed a girl in her position would do. But walking one afternoon along the old rail spur where the abandoned elevator still stood, its tin roof catching the late sun, Alara found herself drawn to it the way a person is drawn back to a room where they once felt safe, and when she inquired at the county land office, she learned that Pruitt's milling concern, having long since written the condemned structure off as a worthless liability, rather than an asset, had let the taxes on the small parcel lapse for years, and that the county, weary of carrying a derelict building on its rolls, would sign the deed over to anyone willing to clear the $6 owed and haul the structure off the books entirely. It seemed, to everyone who heard of it afterward, a purchase made out of sentiment rather than sense. A young woman with no trade and no prospects, spending nearly her entire fortune on a hollow tower that could not shelter her properly through even a mild autumn, let alone a Kansas winter. But something in Alara, some quiet, stubborn thread of her father's own deliberate patience, told her that the elevator was not merely a ruin. It was the one place in Millbrook Crossing that still held the shape of her father's daily life, the office where she had once sat beside him balancing sums by lamplight, and she signed the deed with a steadiness that surprised even Otto Marsh, the tired county clerk who processed it, and who remembered her father well enough to wish her, quietly, better luck with the place than the county itself had ever managed. She moved what little she owned into the elevator's small office within days, sweeping out years of dust and rodent nesting, patching what gaps in the walls she could reach, and setting about, with a discipline she recognized as her father's own, to make at least one room of the great empty structure livable before the weather turned. It was on a cool morning in early October, while she was clearing rotted boards from beneath the loading platform, where wagons had once backed in to unload their wheat onto the elevator's old scale, that her hand, sweeping away years of packed dirt and chaff, struck something solid and metallic buried just beneath the platform's foundation timbers. Wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and canvas sacking, long since gone brittle and stiff with age. It took her the better part of an hour, working carefully with a trowel and her bare hands, to free the object entirely from the earth that had held it. And when she finally lifted it clear, she found herself holding a heavy strongbox, its lock rusted solid, small enough to carry, but weighted, unmistakably, with papers rather than coin. Her father's old habits rose in her the moment she saw it, the same instinct that had once let her catch an error in his sums before he'd found it himself. And she knew, even before she managed to work the rusted lock open with a chisel that evening by lamplight, that whatever her father had buried beneath his own elevator's loading platform, in a place only a man who worked that platform every day would ever think to hide something, was not something he had wanted found by just anyone. It was something he had wanted found by someone who belonged there. Inside the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well against the years, Alara found a leather ledger in her father's own unmistakable hand, its pages filled with the careful, dated columns she remembered from childhood. But these entries were different from any accounts she'd ever helped him balance, page after page recording, in his precise script, the true weight and true sale price of grain moving through the cooperative's elevator across nearly 2 years, set against a second column recording what had actually been credited to the farmers. The gap between the two growing steadily wider as Silas Pruitt's influence over the buying contracts had grown. Beneath the ledger lay a bundle of letters, several in her father's hand, and never sent, Drafts, it seemed, of a formal complaint he had been composing to the State Grain Inspector's office in Topeka, laying out precisely the discrepancy he'd uncovered and naming Silas Pruitt directly as the man diverting cooperative funds through falsified weight records at the scale house. And beneath the letters, folded separately in its own protective wrapping, Alara found something that made her breath catch entirely. The cooperative's original founding charter, signed in 1879 by all 6 founding families, including a clause, one Alara had never once heard spoken of in all her years in Millbrook Crossing, stating plainly that no majority ownership of the cooperative's elevator and equipment could be transferred to any outside buyer without unanimous, written consent of all 6 founding families or their direct heirs, a clause that, if it had ever been honored, would have made every one of Silas Pruitt's later acquisitions of the cooperative's shares legally void from the very start, since Henrik Voss, holding one of the 6 founding shares and having died without ever signing any transfer of it, had, in law, if not in practice, remained a rightful owner of the cooperative all along, a right that had passed, upon his death, directly and entirely to his only living child. Alara spent the better part of a week absorbing the full weight of what she'd found, walking the length of the old elevator floor at night, turning it over in her mind, before she understood clearly what her father's careful hiding of the strongbox truly meant. He had not simply been gathering proof of Pruitt's fraud in the weighing of grain, damning as that proof still was. He had discovered, in the course of his own bookkeeping, that Pruitt's entire consolidation of the county's grain trade rested on a legal foundation more fragile than anyone in Millbrook Crossing had ever realized, since the founding charter's unanimous consent clause meant that at least 2, and very possibly more, of the ownership transfers Pruitt had negotiated over the years, sales made under duress by families in the worst years of the drought, might never have been legally valid at all, buried and forgotten in a founding document that Pruitt himself, arriving in the county after its signing, may well never have known existed. Why Henrik had chosen to bury the strongbox rather than simply carry it home, Alara could only guess it until she found, tucked into the very back of the ledger, a final short note in her father's hand, dated only weeks before his death, explaining that he no longer trusted his own house against a possible search, that he had heard, secondhand, that Pruitt's men had grown suspicious of his inquiries to the state inspector's office, and that he meant to hide the proof somewhere only he, or someday a child of his own raised the way he'd raised Alara, would ever think to look, beneath the very platform where the wheat itself was weighed. The one place in all of Millbrook Crossing that had always, to Henrik Voss, represented the plain, unglamorous, load-bearing truth of a farmer's life. He had meant, the note made clear, to retrieve it himself once he'd gathered a final piece of corroborating evidence from the state inspector's own records. The fever had taken him before he ever got the chance, and the truth he'd hidden had waited, patient as the land itself, for 9 years beneath a loading platform nobody thought worth digging under, until his daughter, cast out with $6 and a stubborn heart, bought the ruin back and found it. Word travels quickly in a small county, and it did not take long for Silas Pruitt, now a wealthy and thoroughly respected figure who sat on the county agricultural board and had recently underwritten the building of Millbrook Crossing's new schoolhouse, to hear that Henrik Voss's daughter had bought back the old condemned elevator and was spending her days poring over old papers found somewhere on the property. He came to see her himself on a bright, cold afternoon, arriving in a handsome carriage that looked almost comically out of place before the weathered old structure, and his manner, when Alara met him at the base of the loading platform, was warm and faintly condescending. The manner of a powerful man humoring a grieving young woman's sentimental attachment to a worthless old building. He offered, first, to buy the elevator and its ground from her for $15, a sum meant to seem more than generous for a hollow ruin. And when Alara, keeping her voice as level and careful as her father had once kept his ledgers, declined, his warmth cooled by careful, visible degrees, and he suggested that whatever old papers a lonely, imaginative girl believed she'd found were almost certainly the confused ramblings of a man whose judgment, in his final fevered months, had perhaps not been entirely sound, and that a young woman with no family standing and no protector would do well not to make trouble for a man whose goodwill, he reminded her pointedly, extended to a great many struggling families throughout the county who depended on his fair dealing to survive a hard season. He left without ever raising his voice, and Alara stood on the sagging boards of her father's old platform and watched his fine carriage roll away, understanding fully that she was now in a contest with the wealthiest, most respected man in the county. Armed with nothing but a dead man's ledger, a bundle of unsent letters, and a 19-year-old charter clause that no one alive but herself seemed to know still existed. She did not fight him alone for long, though it took her the better part of that autumn to find the allies who mattered. She went first, with real fear in her chest, to Otto Marsh at the land office, who confirmed, after searching the county's old deed records at her request, that the original 1879 charter was indeed still on file, forgotten in the depths of the archive, its unanimous consent clause exactly as her father's copy described it, never once formally repealed or amended by any recorded vote. Marsh, in turn, brought her quietly to the two surviving founding families of the original cooperative, the Halversons and the Odells, elderly now but sharp-eyed, who had spent years believing their own hard bargains with Pruitt's company had simply been the price of surviving the drought, and who listened, in the Halversons' own parlor, on a cold evening, as Alara read aloud her father's ledger and the charter's forgotten clause, watching decades of quiet, swallowed resignation give way, family by family, to something closer to outrage. It was old Mrs. Odell who remembered, once prompted, that her own late husband had always sworn Pruitt's first purchase of their shares had been made under a threat of ruinous foreclosure, timed suspiciously close to a poor harvest. A threat that made far more sense now in light of a man who had, according to Henrik's ledger, been quietly skimming from the very grain sales that determined whether such foreclosures came due at all. Among their number, too, was a young county land attorney named Thaddeus Reyes, distantly related to the Odells, still building his practice and glad of a case with real substance behind it. And it was Reyes who explained to Alara that a founding charter clause, however long forgotten, still carried full legal weight if it had never been properly voided, and that Henrik Voss's ledger, corroborated now by the Halversons and Odell's own memories of the timing of their sales, gave them grounds enough to challenge the legality of Pruitt's ownership before the county court itself. The reckoning, when it came, unfolded not in a single dramatic confrontation, but across a tense, deliberate county court hearing in the depths of that winter, one that drew nearly every farming family for 20 miles into the courthouse's narrow gallery to watch. Thaddeus Reyes laid the founding charter before the judge first, its unanimous consent clause plain and unambiguous even after 19 years of dust, and then set beside it, one by one, the disputed sales of the Halverson and Odell shares, each timed, as Henrik's ledger and the family's own memories now confirmed, to a season of manufactured hardship that Pruitt's skimming of the cooperatives. True grain proceeds had likely helped engineer in the first place. Silas Pruitt's own attorney argued, predictably, that a forgotten clause in an old farmer's agreement could hardly override 2 decades of settled business practice. But the judge, a careful man himself and visibly moved by the weight of Henrik Voss's meticulous, dated ledger entries, Entries that read less like accusation than plain, patient bookkeeping ruled that the original transfers, having never received the unanimous consent the charter required, were indeed voidable, and ordered a full accounting of the cooperative's true proceeds across the disputed years, to be conducted under the court's own oversight rather than Pruitt's. That accounting, completed over the following months, confirmed the pattern Henrik had died trying to prove, and Silas Pruitt, facing both the voided transfers and a substantial restitution judgment for the skimmed proceeds, chose in the end to settle rather than risk further exposure of just how much of his fortune had been built on a scale quietly weighted against the very farmers who trusted him. He did not lose everything. The law of that time and place, cautious about ruining a man of his standing entirely, allowed him to retain his newer milling operation near the rail junction. But he relinquished, under the settlement Thaddeus Reyes negotiated, full ownership of the old cooperative elevator back to its rightful founding families and their heirs, along with a restitution sum that, divided among the Halversons, the Odells, and Alara herself as Henrik Voss's sole heir, was enough to see the old elevator properly rebuilt and reopened as an independent cooperative once more, exactly as the 6 founding families had first intended it in 1879. It is worth remembering, now, that Alara Voss had been put out at 21 with $6.40 and no one's blessing, and that within a single season, in a ruin nobody else wanted, she uncovered not merely her own rightful inheritance, but a truth that returned an entire farming community's independence to it after nearly 2 decades of quiet loss. She did not rebuild the elevator to stand as a monument to herself. She rebuilt it, with the Halversons and the Odells standing beside her at the ribbon raising the following harvest, as the same plain, working cooperative her father had helped found, its scale honest again, its books, which Alara herself kept from that season forward, open to any farmer who wished to check her, sums the way she had once checked her father's. She hung in the small office where she and her father had once balanced figures together by lamplight. The original 1879 charter alongside her father's recovered ledger, not as trophies, but as reminders that the truth a family keeps, even buried beneath the ground itself, does not decay the way timber and tin eventually do. Alara's name is still spoken in Millbrook Crossing, not as a woman who inherited good fortune, but as the girl who bought back a hollow ruin for $6 and found, beneath its loading platform, the patient, unfinished work her father had left for her to complete. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Alara's story tonight. If her father's quiet integrity and her own steady patience moved you even a little, we'd be so grateful if you'd hit follow or subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story like hers. And we'd love to hear, in the comments below, what is a time your own family or your own community found real value in something everyone else had already written off. We read every story you share with us. Until next time, stay close.